The American workforce, if you look at the data, depending on how you slice it, it's either stagnant or shrinking. We don't have enough people for you to be picky about which people. For a workforce or population to stay at the same level, the average couple needs to have 2.1 to 2.3 kids. In America, the average couple has 1.6. That's just data. So therefore, what it means is I need to go find talent wherever it is, prepare it however I need to, and then I need to keep it on as long as possible. Those demographics are going to defeat you at some point because we don't have Americans to waste. And I've been lucky to never have to be trying to get away from something, partially because generally it's been kind of mission focused, problem focused. But the question is, if you have the idea of the problem in your head, even if you don't know the job, if you can see in your head, whatever I do next, I will be accomplishing X, then you're going towards something.
Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast exploring life-changing career moves. I'm your host, Brian Aquart. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the bold decisions that transform their careers and lives. Let's dive in. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Why I Left. Not every resignation is loud. Some happen quietly over time, when staying starts to limit the good you can actually do. Today, I'm joined by Chike Aguh, Head of Innovation and Strategy at the Kapor Center. Chike has built a career by knowing the difference between leading something and going towards something. And that distinction matters more now than ever. Let's go check it out. All right, welcome back. So our guest today is Chike Aguh, a nationally respected leader at the intersection of workforce, policy, and innovation. Chike has served in government, advised major institutions, and helped organizations navigate moments of real uncertainty, including during the pandemic. And he currently serves as the head of innovation and strategy at the Kapor Center. He's also a fellow presidential leadership scholar, and his career isn't defined by a single leap, but by a disciplined series of choices rooted in service, clarity, and long-term impact. This conversation is about how you build a career that actually holds together. And so I'm very excited to have him on the show. So Chike, welcome to Why I Left. How you doing, man?
Doing all right, Brian. Thank you so much for having me. And more importantly, just thank you for having this space. I think right now there are really few spaces that have these types of conversations. So when someone creates it, I want to acknowledge it. So just thank you for what you've built.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. This has been a labor of love. And as we've been continuing to grow, it's important. Like the feedback I get on this show is just so awesome to hear because like you said, so many people are going through things right now. And hopefully this could be a safe space where we can all talk about the real that comes out in this work. And, so I'd love to start one by saying, I know we'll talk a little bit about PLS on occasion, but I just want to appreciate everything you've done. You were actually the lead, the connect that got me into PLS and, you introduced me to the program. And so it has been everything that you said it would be, definitely a life-changing experience for me. And I'm just glad that now we're both alums. And I just thank you for planting that seed for me when you did.
Look, let me say one thing, which is I met you, Brian, kind of in this work around kind of healthcare workforce that Bloomberg Philanthropy supports and that you help lead in New York through Northwell. And when I saw you and the work you were leading, it's kind of like when you're a scout for like a sport and you're thinking about something and you see somebody, you're like, oh, that guy. And so like literally, I would extend the thanks the other way, which is you were everything the program was looking for. You were everything I think kind of the work that you were doing that the country needs. And so honestly, thank you for not making me look silly on the other side as far as performing well. But no, I think honestly, for those of us who've experienced a good thing, our job is to pay it forward, and particularly to pay it forward to people who are going to make the most of it. You are a prime example of that. So in many ways, like it was an easy thing to do because you made it an easy thing to do by just being who you are.
Awesome. I thank you for that. So you've worked at this intersection of policy, workforce development, like you mentioned how we met, and organizational leadership. How do you usually explain your work to someone outside of those worlds?
It's a great question. I think if you were to say it like kind of at a high level, I would argue that kind of any endeavor of progress we're looking to deal with as a society or a world, pick your issue, climate change, economic development, even dealing with political discourse, political polarization. The bottleneck, the ceiling, the limiting factor is people, whether those are workers, whether they're in economic development, is it entrepreneurs, whether if it's scientific innovation, it's innovators. But in the end, I have tried to figure out how do we make sure we have the people we need to do the things that we think are most important in our society. Because in the end, with the right people, you can do anything. Without the right people, you can't do anything. And so that's kind of how I've been at the top level. And I'll say for me, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit, partially my own kind of life story and the journey of my family in America has kind of proved that. And it's kind of why I probably focused on that really early as a young person and now into kind of, mid careerhood.
Yeah. And, and looking back, what are some of those early experiences that shaped how you think about service, opportunity, and responsibility, especially at scale?
It's a great question. I think, and I'm not sure if President Clinton used this phrase with you, but I heard him use it once when he released his book after his presidency. He said, "We are all prisoners of biography." And it is very much true for me. My family were kind of a very classic immigrant story to this country. My family is from a village on the far side of the world in Nigeria that most Nigerians themselves will never see and never visit. It is none of my grandparents went past middle school. My mother and my father, who were born in that village, literally over the hill from one another. They grew up on streets that were unpaved then. They're mostly unpaved now. They had Peace Corps volunteers in their classrooms, and they both kind of scratched the lottery ticket and got to come to the United States as international students back in the late 70s and early 80s. I am the first person in the entire history of my family born in America. And so very much because of access to education and economic opportunity, you go from in a single generation in my family, 4 grandparents who didn't go past middle school, to my parents who had Peace Corps volunteers in their classrooms, to me who got to have some of the best opportunities, go to the best schools in the world and serve an American president. And what I like to think of when I think about this now as an older person, this is kind of what happens when you get it right as a society, as a community, as a country. I think when you look at the data, we don't get it right often enough with enough people in enough places. So what I like to say kind of tritely, but I think it's true, this country has given me more than I can ever repay, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying. And I think through every part of my career, I've tried to repay what's been given to me. And my mechanism has been, how do we make sure that we have the people we need to do the things that need to be done? And how do we make sure that everyone can do that thing that needs to be done? And so whether it's starting my career in education, literally as a policymaker and as a teacher, to the work that I'm doing now, that's kind of been the through line and the kind of North Star on the mission.
That's amazing. I learn something about you new every time. I mean, when you think about, it sounds like kind of lofty, right? But like that American dream type of story, it's like you're an embodiment of that. And so that's actually pretty cool to hear. Pivoting a little bit, talking about some of the work that you're doing. As I noticed, and as we've spoken, there wasn't really one dramatic resignation moment for you, but there was like a series of intentional moves. When did you realize the lane you were in was limiting your impact?
I would say it a different way. I think I would say, and it's something that President Obama said. If you go on YouTube, there's a speech he gave to a class of White House interns, summer White House interns. And he said something, I think it was probably in graduate school when I first saw it, but it was a way I started to try and look at the world, which was he said, all of you are ambitious, you want to do great things, and there's a temptation to frame that ambition in terms of a job. There is this job that I want, and the problem is when you frame it as a thing that I want, a job that I want, a title I want to have, there are only so many of those. Not all of you can have that. So a bunch of you are going to be disappointed. And that disappointment can actually lead to everything from depression to simply retreating from the field. He said, if you frame it not as a job I want to have, but a thing I wish to work on, a problem I seek to solve, then the aperture is much more open. And so what I've tried to do generally is when I think about the problems that I seek to solve, the problem that I seek to solve, I've generally tried to say, where at this moment can I make the most difference, exert the most leverage on that problem? And it has led me to some interesting places I didn't quite expect. But but taking that mindset, I think in some ways I've been much more kind of spiritually healthy. And also it's expanded my mind. Almost every job that I've ever taken, I would tell you I didn't envision that job. Like if you had asked me like 5 years before, would you be in a job like X? I would have been like, I would not have foreseen it. Few, maybe. I think I always vaguely had an interest in serving on the federal level. It's something I studied for and prepared for in some ways for a while. A bunch of other things along the way, absolutely not. And I think because I said, not what is the job I wish to have, but the problem that I seek to work on, I had a much wider aperture. The other thing that I'll say is, as I got older, particularly after I'd been a CEO myself, I realized how important it was to work for the right people, to have people that I could learn from and learn with and learn through. And I think what happens is as you get older, become more senior, do more things, the amount of people who can actually teach you, mentor you, that group becomes a little smaller over time. because in some ways now your job is to mentor others. And so whether it was when I worked for General McChrystal, which was a life-changing experience, or whether it was working for Julie Sue when she was Deputy Secretary of Labor and now, and then acting Labor Secretary, whether it's the work I do now with people like Commission Free to Kapor, seeking out people that I could learn from, that has also been, again, if I look, it makes sense when I look backward, but I try to seek those people. That's been kind of what's gotten it. So it's been more about how do I focus on the problem, take the role that at that moment allows me to exert the most leverage and impact on that for the people that I seek to serve. And then it allows you to not stay too long, but also have a wide aperture for what you could do next. Because I think probably the saddest thing is if there was a role that someone could take on that would make a big difference that they missed because they were so focused on, I only can do this.
I think a lot of people don't have that frame of mind and end up missing certain opportunities. So I love that you framed it that way. At different points in these transitions, what did you have to let go of in order to move forward? Like identity, certainty, or credibility? What did that look like?
It's funny. I think when I think about most of the transitions that I've been in, very rarely did I necessarily have a job when I left. So there was always this period of uncertainty. You kind of like, I'm jumping without a net. And it's particularly for those who are watching who have particularly families and kids and spouses, that it can be particularly scary. And it's funny, I always give my wife a lot of credit. So my wife is very different from me. My wife's a physician. She's been a physician at a single institution for almost 15 years. There's probably very few more secure professions than being a physician. And I remember when she and I first got married, I said, look, our lives are going to be very different. You likely will not necessarily be in the same job, but you will likely always have a job. It'll be more certain. And I said, for me, there may be ups and downs. There may be periods where it's not clear what's going to come next. And I remember I would ask her, I said, look, for the first 90 days, just give me grace. After like 90 days, you can be on my case all the time. And generally what's always happened is I've always ended up getting a job like day 87, day 88. Like it's very, very interesting. But I think the first thing is like, wow, I have to step into something sight unseen. That's number one. And particularly when you have people depending on you, like that's just real. And so it's why that problem orientation has been really important to me. If this was just about a job, I don't know if I would have taken all those jobs because candidly, the certainty would have been more important than what could come next. I think the other thing is, and I think I've been fortunate there, which is I've tried not to make my identity the institution, if that makes sense. That is really important. One is it's healthy. I think there should, because when you make the institution your identity, it actually can make you at times don't do all the things you need to do while you're in the job that you need to do. For example, there are times you need to change some stuff. Well, if you see it as you, it's really hard to change yourself. As ask anyone who's been married, anyone who's asked their spouse to change, it's really difficult. It's the same thing with oneself. Everyone wants change, but no one wants to change. So I've always been lucky and important to have my family, my wife. We have 2 kids. My son is 8, about to be 9. My daughter's 4. I've been lucky to have great friends, like from our Presidential Leadership Scholars cohort, who exist outside the job, so that when it comes time to move, not all of me is invested in that. And let me be clear. Anyone who knows me know I kind of run through the tape, through walls. I will work longer than probably advisable. But mentally being able to have an identity apart from the institution is really important. I would probably say my identity is very much based on the problem I seek to solve, but not necessarily an institution at the time that I am in. And I think that is the way we want to look at it. I would say the other thing, which is always a barrier, is how will it look? In the sense of there are times that people say, oh, I'm leaving without a job. How will it look? I would argue to you that's the least of your concerns. How it will look is how it will look. You should be more concerned with what it is. Yeah, there are tactical things to manage and things like that. But, I remember when I transitioned from the McChrystal group. And it was during COVID. And to give some background, so I'd been at the McChrystal group for about, that's point, almost 2 years. And I was leading our strategy work. And during COVID, the McChrystal group took on an amazing body of work around. We had previously worked with large organizations, mainly private sector, to help them manage their teams, create more leadership synergy, so on and so forth. Really kind of organizational consulting, as well as looking at talent and leadership for mainly Fortune 1000 blue chip clients. During COVID, and if anyone remembers that time, literally think of March 2020, we began to have governments reach out to us to say, hey, can you help us literally strategically plan how we respond to this unprecedented crisis? The city of Boston, the state of Missouri, the state of Virginia, the state of Nebraska. And partially because I had been in government before that, I ended up being the point of the spear for kind of just a lot of that coordination while we had amazing teams on the ground doing great work. And it was in that time where I kind of said, you know what? I kind of need to get back to service more formally. And I remember I called two of my bosses, Barry Sanders, who was a former, probably the best business person I've ever worked with. I called Chris Fussell, former SEAL Team 6 guy, who was my direct boss. I remember I called General McChrystal, and I called him, and it was a short call, and I basically said, "Sir, I so thank you so much for the honor of working here, but I need to kind of get back to service." And to a person, they were so supportive. One, first of almost all of them had worn the uniform. But secondly, they said, "This is a crazy time in the life of the country. Like, people like you should want to serve." And so I ended up working for a nonprofit after that. And we were working on higher education issues. Particularly, we were working with community colleges, trying to figure out how do we help people who lost their jobs during this crazy time. Just to put it in perspective, in May of 2020, 20 million American jobs evaporated. To put it in perspective, the highest month of job loss before that in American history, December of '08, was about 900,000 job losses. So community college professors were trying to figure out, how do we help? And so that was what I worked on. Someone could say, well, you went from working at this great firm with a very well-known name to a nonprofit, less well-known. Well, how would that look? And I could have let that stop me. But in the end, the problem and the mission was top of mind for me. And weirdly, what ended up happening was I ended up staying at that nonprofit. I was there for about 6 months. Loved my work, but we had an election during that time, and that was when I was tapped by President Biden to join the administration. So it's funny how things work, but I think people can worry about how it looks, and that can stop them from making a move that they should.
And you said something in one of our calls where you said like there's a real difference between leaving something and going somewhere.
Yes.
That was very profound. How do you know which one you're doing?
I mean, some of it is just like honesty with oneself. I've been lucky to never have to be trying to get away from something, partially because generally it's been kind of mission focused, problem focused. But the question is, if you have the idea of the problem in your head, even if you don't know the job, if you can see in your head, whatever I do next, I will be accomplishing X, then you're going towards something. If you are basically defining where you want to go next as just don't want it to be like that, you're running from something. And look, and by the way, every now and again, you need to run from something. Look, that happens. I have generally tried to be going somewhere than running from something. And I think the biggest thing that I tell people is, what will be true because you were in that next job? Like, what is the thing, but for me being in wherever I'm going next, that will not have happened? And that's kind of how I push people to think when they think about this.
I like that. If you hadn't left when you did, what do you think it would have cost you?
It's a great question. I think you don't have a crystal ball. You can't do a Monte Carlo simulation. You can't kind of do the multiverse and figure out what would have happened. I don't know if I would have served in the federal government when I did. I mean, I didn't want to, but I could imagine just literally just like path dependency. It might have been hard to transition, hard to move, so on and so forth. And one of the things that I'm most proud of in my life is I remember I was offered the role of Chief Innovation Officer at Labor. I was offered that. It was January 7th, the day after the insurrection. It was the day after the insurrection. I was sworn in. Joe Biden was sworn in at 12 noon on January 20th. I was sworn in roughly 2:20. And that time, particularly 2021, first half of 2022, that was a crazy time in the life of the world, and particularly in the government and so on and so forth. And I am glad I served during that time. It is a time I will tell my kids about when I'm an old man. I won't say we got it all right. I won't say we did everything really good. But my view of it is, and General McChrystal would say this a lot, you want to run to the sound of the guns. When a lot of people are running away, you want to run too. And I like to think at my best, I was running to where the problems were. I would have been afraid that I would have missed that opportunity. Not because they would have stopped me, but I've seen it personally being harder for myself. I love that firm. I loved my colleagues. I loved the leadership. And not that I didn't love the Education Design Lab where I went as well. But what was interesting was I was doing literally workforce development, higher education work, which in many ways prepared me very specifically for the role I stepped into at the Department of Labor. And then ironically, all the private sector work I had done in the McChrystal Group also was super useful because in the end, we have to connect workers with employers. And so weirdly, I might have missed a key piece of preparation that made it easier for me to serve in that role when I did.
I think that's a great point because it's almost like everything happens for a reason, right?
Yes.
And so, you're working across government, advisory, in these private sector spaces. Not a lot of people get that type of experience. Where do leaders consistently misunderstand how change really happens?
How much time do we have? So I'll say a couple things. I think about like when I've dealt with, whether it's clients, whether it was in government myself, and I always say when I talk about this, these are things that I have not fully mastered. No, very few people have. I'll say a couple things. The one is a quote I always use. Actually, There are two quotes I would use. One is from Yogi Berra. For those of you who grew up watching the Yankees, he has a lot of great quotes. A bunch of which he actually didn't say. They just made up along the way. But one of the things he says is, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. It sounds very basic, but it's very true. The amount of leaders who I meet who don't know where they're going, and that is your job. There are lots of things as a leader that are not your job. That one is your job. Where are we going? And let me be clear, you don't just make that up by yourself. You obviously are supposed to be in conversation with stakeholders in the world, also with your internal team. But in the end, your job is to ensure that it's clear where you are going. And then your job is that in every meeting that you're in, everything that you're doing, you're asking, are we getting closer to that place or farther away? That is number one. And and a lot of my roles, really in the process, have always been strategy roles. Even now in my current role, I'm a strategy guy. And I'm always the guy's like, wait, what are we doing here? That's number one. I think number two is an alignment piece. And here's what I mean by that. So it's a story I used to tell to clients when I was in the private sector a lot, which is from President Kennedy. I think it's in 1962, President Kennedy has said, we're going to the moon. And he goes to what is now Johnson Space Center in Houston. He walks in there. And if anyone's seen it, it's a huge building. And he walks in and there's a janitor mopping the floor. And he goes to the janitor and he says, sir, what is it that you do here? And the janitor looks up and he says, sir, I am putting a man on the moon. And I always tell that story and I say, what's interesting is not just what he said, but what he was doing. He said, I am putting a man on the moon. He knows where we're going. But now look at what he was doing. He was not trying to be the rocket scientist doing the equations. He wasn't trying to be the engineer building the rocket. He wasn't trying to be the astronaut preparing to go on the module. He was mopping the floor because my job to make that thing happen is to keep this floor clean so that these guys can get to where they need to go. If I walked into your organization today and asked a random person, what is it that you do here? What would they tell me? And usually when I would ask this question, everyone would be like, oh my God, please don't do that. Please. Like, I don't know what they're going to say. If you have not created that level of clarity on where you are going, what you are doing, and then what that person should be doing at that very second, you've not totally fulfilled the obligation of leadership. The third thing is, I always say when you are trying to make a change in your organization or even in the world, there are three types of people. What I call the first mover, the person who wants to change and they wanted it yesterday. You have your laggard who will change over their dead body. And then you have most people, which is most people are in the middle. They'll go with where they see the momentum. I call it the mushy middle. Most people in an organization, where they're trying to make a change, what they do is they go to the laggard. The laggard because they're going to be the loudest when you try to make a change. And what happens is usually because there's no change happening, the laggard doesn't move. The first movers get disillusioned and some of them leave. And the mushy middle doesn't go anywhere because they're like, well, nothing's happening. One of the things I learned, and I learned it from a mentor of mine, was start with the first mover. Start with the person who wants to change. Give them whatever you can and let them make that change in however small way they can. And then when they make that small change, praise them, give them more resources, give them more attention. And then something happens. The mushy middle's like, oh, something's happening here. And leadership is rewarding that. And the laggards do one of two things. Either they change, or some of them say it's not the place for me. That was a key thing. Because most people, even think about when you try to do something in your org that you think it might be controversial, most people go to people who are going to be against, who they know will be against it first. And the problem is nothing happens.
Yeah, because they shut it down.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, because they shut it down. But there's always one person who actually does go to that person and say, I need you to do this. I will support you. Just go. And then you begin to create that kind of snowball effect of change. The only last thing that I'll say, and it's yes about change, but also about leadership. General McChrystal would use this phrase. It's in his book, Team of Teams, leader as gardener. He said, your job as a leader is to be like a gardener. And basically a gardener, what they do is they have their plot of land, they have plants, and their job, yes, plant seeds, yes, harvest, but also clear out the obstacles, clear out the rocks, clear out the things within that place that'll keep those plants from growing. And then let them grow and do what they do. Your job as a leader is the same thing. My job is not to do the job. My job is to remove all the obstacles, all the things that inhibit people's growth and people doing their job, and then let them work. Yes, give direction. Yes, give clear rules. You built the fence. The fence are the big, important rules that have to be followed. Provide nutrients, provide resources. But too many leaders think their job is to do the job. And the issue is you can't do that. There's not enough of you to go around. The only way to do what this org needs to do is that other people have to be empowered, be prepared, be grown to do those jobs. And by the way, the growing analogy, a seed is different from a full-grown plant. That requires nurturing, that requires this. And the question is, okay, because you also, again, in some ways, I wouldn't tell someone on their first day, unless I knew their capacities, do this super hard thing that no one's ever done before. The deal we do in a relationship is you grow a person over time. That's part of your job too.
That's key advice too, as people need to think about how they're moving about in their respective either organizations or just within themselves. I want to talk a little bit about kind of this world of work, right? Because we overlap in some similar spaces. What does the most dangerous myth organizations still believe about talent, skills, and the future of work?
Boy, I don't know if it's a myth, but let me say it another way. I think there are things that people say but don't fully believe.
Okay.
If they did, things would look different. I think most people would say, I've heard it said by many people, talent is universal, opportunity is not. I don't know if everyone believes that, because if they did, they would seek talent differently, hire talent differently, prepare talent differently. Candidly, to paraphrase my old boss, President Biden, the American workforce would look more like America if that was universally believed. I think in many ways that is the core thing that everyone has to believe. You have to believe that there is talent everywhere. Or let me say it another way, that the only thing that should determine if someone can do a job is if they can do the job, not a bunch of other factors that are immutable and candidly have been turned against them for too long. I think that is the biggest thing that people say they believe, but actually, if you look at how people operate, we just don't see it enough. I think, for example, if we believed that, we would recruit in different places. You would come to a state like mine, Maryland, and you would do much more recruiting in a place like East and West Baltimore, the inner beltway of Prince George's County, in the largely white, largely rural, largely poor part of Maryland, Western Maryland, near in Appalachia. You'd be on the Eastern Shore, which is basically like Eastern North Carolina, very agricultural, very rural, mainly so on and so forth. That's just one example. That's where people recruit. Similarly, you would work better to fill in gaps that people may have. Yes, they came to you through a different route, and you're going to have to do different support to get them through. By the way, for other workers that have, you also give them support of different types. So it's not like you're doing something special, you're just doing something differently. The reason that this belief is so dangerous, and now I'm going to get empirical, is the American workforce, if you look at the data, depending on how you slice it, it's either stagnant or shrinking. We actually don't have enough people for you to be picky about which people. If we're very candid, for a workforce or population to stay at the same level, the average couple needs to have 2.1 to 2.3 kids. In America, the average couple has 1.6 today. That's not a political argument, or that's just data. So therefore, what it means is I need to go find talent wherever it is, prepare it however I need to, and then I need to keep it on as long as possible. By the way, it's not the old days where, all right, I have a super hard environment, that person leaves, so what? I have 10 people who want to be in this job too. Those demographics are going to defeat you at some point. So that's why I think it's a thing that people don't believe enough, and it's why it's dangerous for them not to, because we don't have Americans to waste.
Great point. And, I was very intrigued by some of your work during the pandemic. And looking back at that time, what did it reveal about leadership that most institutions failed to learn from?
Again, you're asking hard questions. In some of the work I led at the Education Design Lab, we did a 3-day summit for community college leaders on some of this, on kind of reskilling, particularly during that time. This is in the summer of 2020. And one of our speakers was at that time the CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, but now my governor, Governor Moore. And he said something which I've never forgotten, which is he said, a lot of great leadership has been exemplified during this time, and a lot of poor leadership has been exposed. Let me say one thing, and let's talk about, there's a lot of debate about remote work, hybrid work, all this. But I'll say one thing. I used to get asked a lot, how do you make remote work successful? Like, what does leadership need to do? And I would say, it's kind of the things you were supposed to be doing before. For example, all right, if you were using remote in-person work because that was how you made sure that someone was doing their work, you had a problem. If the only way you know someone is working is that they're in your eyesight, you have a problem. You should know, again, where are you going? What are the things that I should be seeing to tell me that I'm getting closer to my target? Which, by the way, shouldn't be like eyesight. It should be like, these are things I can empirically prove. And then lastly, I should have enough compelling work that this person wants to work on that stuff without me being there. Those are basic leadership things. And what we found was, candidly, I think a lot of leadership used proximity as a crutch for poor management and poor leadership.
Absolutely.
And I think that is the biggest thing that was exposed. Candidly, debates about remote work, hybrid work, in-person work. I don't think all those things that were exposed have been fixed. And so when I see a lot of the return to office mandates, and you ask why, when I hear, people aren't working, we need to have culture, it's kind of a bunch of hand-wavy stuff. What I generally say is, if you're going to bring people back to the office, you owe it to them to be precise on why. You need to be precise on what they need to be together for in a particular space they can't do apart in a bunch of different spaces. You owe that to them. And I think what's happening is, candidly, I don't know if we fixed all that some of that poor leadership. Therefore, people are going back to the crutch of proximity. I also think there are also a bunch of big commercial real estate leases that people
That,
want to
that's
make
where I was
sure
about to go.
that they get the proper money from and all that, so on and so forth. But that's not a good enough reason. I always remember in one of my first classes when I was in graduate school, there's a case study from HBS on a guy named Jan Carlson. Jan Carlson ended up being, I think he was head of either Finnish or Swedish Air. This is in the 70s. And then he became head of Scandinavian Airlines, SAS. And so when he became head of SAS, both of these were turnaround jobs. He's kind of like the prototypical turnaround CEO. So he comes in to Scandinavian Airlines and he basically says, look, our strategy is we are going to serve the business customer. That's going to be everything that we do. But they said, and his team said to him, well, we just bought these like literally like 10 planes that are for passenger travel. And he said, mothball them. No, we're not going to use them. And so what is he? And so they end up leasing them out to other airlines. But he literally said, no, I understand you did a huge CapEx expense, but this does not fit in our strategy, does not fit where we are going. We will not use a CapEx purchase make us to justify committing to a poor strategy.
So true. Yeah, that I have so many thoughts on the return to work, hybrids, of all those things, because I do think that a lot of the return to work mandates are a bit short-sighted, right? And I love that you raise a point that leadership and organizations owe it to team members as to the why, because work was getting done, arguably at a higher clip when folks were remote. And now that things are back to, it's like, well, work wasn't getting done. Well, wait a minute, but we were just getting praised 6 months ago for all the great work and all these other things. And so I love that analogy. It's a bunch of hand waving because I think that is what it is, right? It is those things. And so I'll be curious to see how this all plays out because, I talk a lot about this and with some other guests around, is there going to be a moment where someone or folks are just like, you know what? No, like I'm not going to be doing this. And then back to what we were just talking about, if people realize they don't need to be coming in, they're just going to find somewhere else to work where they can fit their lifestyle in a better place. And that's going to cause a whole set of other issues. But
and by the way, intersect that with the demographic issues that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Yes.
If you were pick Goldman Sachs 20 years ago, shoot, somebody don't want to like work in the office, forget them because I got 10 people who want to do that job. As this shrinks, and I can tell you for some of the services that I follow around emerging technology and so on and so forth, you're talking about 7-to-1 open jobs to a person who might be qualified and looking. So what do you do with that? And so now I will give two kind of counterpoints, not counterpoints, but things to consider. And I am not totally in the remote everything. I'm not there. Where I generally am is there are a couple of places where I do think in person is really good for alignment. Hey, we have our all hands, we're coming in, we're gonna look at strategically where the organization is. I think those are really important. I do think increased in-person time for entry-level employees new to the organization or new in their careers, I do think is important. I do think that is a thing anecdotally that I hear from a lot of younger folk who didn't learn some of the, how will I call it, just anthropology of being in an organization.
Completely
Which I
agree.
think, and that's sociology. I think that's important. I also, from a social capital perspective, bumping into someone, I think there's some of that. So I would be strategic about that. I think but again, be clear on the why versus just being in the same place will create all these benefits. No, I mean, I'll tell you, when we were at labor, I still remember this. My boss, the deputy secretary, later the acting secretary, asked us to look at all of our KPIs during the pandemic period. She asked a very experienced person to do that. And when he came back a week later, he said, ma'am, all the KPIs during, call it mid-2020 to call it mid-2021, they either are the same or they went up. And just to put it in perspective, building that I was in government, this was the Francis Perkins building, holds about 4,000 people. During the pandemic, it was 4,000 people daily. That shrunk to about 750 during the pandemic, just to put it in perspective. So do your math. More than 85% of people were not in the building every day. But the KPIs were either the same or they went up, particularly around employee satisfaction. And so that's why you just will make everything work better. That's just not generally empirically true. And the big question is, how do you use that time specifically and precisely? Generally, most orgs that I feel like have kind of gotten it right, they'll 1 to 3 days a week in person. But what I see them really do well is when folks are in the building, they are using that time to do things they cannot do apart.
Yes.
That's
the key.
They're like, hey, we have our team meeting this day. Everyone meets with their We do our lunch and learn where the young folk meet with one of the senior people. That is what I see. Like the people who I think are kind of getting it right.
That makes a lot of sense. And I agree wholeheartedly with that flow as well, especially on the early careers piece, because they do need to be in person with folks to kind of get that get that flow going. We'd love to talk a little bit about lessons learned and piggyback on an idea that we talked about earlier in the conversation. And it goes back to something not only we talked about here, but previously. You talk about building this career like an iceberg, right? And
Mhm.
chasing this perfect job.
Sure.
Could you explain that idea a little bit more, and why does it matter right now?
Yeah, let me use an analogy. I think it's one I used when we talked about it, which is I was watching. I think I saw some YouTube video, and it was a couples therapist, and someone said, why are so many people not necessarily happy in their marriage? And the therapist said, well, there are lots of reasons, but one of the things that I see in my practice is that a lot of people believe their spouse should be everything. My best friend, my lover, my pickleball partner, my business partner, my person I watch the Netflix show with, and they named all these things, and they're like, no one person can be that. It's impossible. Same way you can't be that for them. So their observation was, I actually think a lot of marriages would be healthier if people had more friends, more closer with their siblings, had these other people in their lives who shoulder some of that load. And they had that would be a healthier kind of human ecosystem than trying to have all that interaction be in one person, because no one person can be that. Transfer that to a career. If you think of your career simply as your 9 to 5, and when I say 9 to 5, I mean your job, your headline on LinkedIn. No one job, very few single jobs will provide you the title with the prestige you want, the level of power you want, the level of budget you want, the level of people you want. Da, 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 da. Or let me say it another way. There are far fewer of those jobs than people who want them. Let me say it like that. Oh, what I began to see, this was really when I was much younger. I was someone, this is in the mid 2000s, before we had like LinkedIn and stuff and Google, or Google was like not as ubiquitous. I love to just research people. It's really just fascinating to me. Like, hey, like I'd find people who I admire, say like, hey, like I just want to figure out what you did, where you were. And what I would notice is the most successful people, the people who I found made the most impact, whether it be in their business, whether it be in for society, had really long bios. And initially I just thought maybe that they had a lot of jobs. What I realized was at any one point in their career, they were not simply their headline job. They had a career that mirrored what I call an iceberg. So if you think about an iceberg, there's this part above the water that you see. But if you look at most icebergs, they are much bigger below the water. And so if you think of your career like that, think of your headline job as the thing above the water that people see. But then there's all this other stuff: board memberships, affiliations, fraternal organizations, so on and so forth. And what people do is those people create this iceberg of a career, this ecosystem of obligations and responsibilities that one personally fulfills them in aggregate, which is far more likely than finding one job that'll do that. And then secondly, it creates these synergies that makes you better in your job. So one example, like I remember once listening to Reid Hoffman. Reid Hoffman at that time served on 12 boards. And they were like, how do you serve on 12 boards? And he said, well, they're actually all synergistic. They actually weirdly make me better at all the others. The one makes me better at the 11 and vice versa. And I think that is what I've sought in kind of my career, but with most successful people, that's what they do. Another analogy that I've heard people use is a solar system. You're not trying to build a star, you're trying to build a solar system. If you think about a solar system, in the middle is a star, and it exerts gravity and light and heat. And someone said, the star is your job, and the gravity is money, as well as a bunch of other things. But there are all these other celestial bodies. There's the earth. For me, the earth is my family. That is the most important. I will protect it at all costs. But then some of them are your board obligations. Some of them are community obligations. Some of them are academic affiliations. Some of them are just people and friends in your life. But you create this, and your goal is basically don't have these celestial bodies crash into each other. And those are the careers, the solar system and the iceberg, that I think lead to the most impact, lead to the most kind of personal health, mental well-being, so on and so forth. And then lastly, which we don't talk about, they lead to the most career resilience, because I've seen in my career, in those kind of uncertain times when I was going from one thing to another, part of the way I would get to the next thing was there were these other obligations in my life that pointed a pathway to something else. For example, when I was leaving my nonprofit CEO job back in 2018, I remember, this is a PLS story. I may have told you this story before. We had a mini reunion for my class, and one of the people in my class was a woman named Lenore, and Lenore was a partner at the McChrystal Group. I did not know what the McChrystal Group was. We had our reunion just in DC. We did it ourselves, and we were just talking. I like the lunch. And she's like, so what are you doing next? Like, I have no idea. She and I talked more, and she said, let's come by the office. And I said, Lenore, I don't even know what you guys do. And I went, and I was like, I like these folks. They kind of liked me, and 2 months later, I was an employee. But because of that PLS affiliation, that part of the iceberg, without her, I would never have ended up in a school. Wouldn't even have known it existed. And so it leads to resilience. So one, you'll make more impact. Two, you'll just be a happier person because You have all these things that are fulfilling all your needs of purpose and service and whatever else it is. And then also, when you do come to those uncertain times, it's going to be those other, because very rarely does the entire earth, like iceberg, fall apart at once. That's very rare. In some ways, diversifying your career and social capital by having all these different obligations. And it's always been true that these other parts of my career in the solar system have helped me get back to the star. Again, to take the analogy further.
Now, moving to some advice for someone mid-career who feels maybe boxed in by their
Sure.
role, but unsure what's next, what's the first honest question they should ask themselves?
I go back to know where you're going. I generally tell people the way you figure out where you're going is there's a concept called ikigai, which many people are familiar with, but to me, it's a 4-circle Venn diagram. And first circle is what do you believe the world needs right now? That question is different for everyone, but what is the world's biggest need? Circle 2 is what am I really good at? And when I say really good at, I have people be really precise. 2 or 3 standard deviations better than average person. Or a heuristic that I use is if they had a conference about that thing and you were not there, someone would say, where is Brian? 3, what do you love? And I separate what do you love versus what are you good at, because they're not always the same thing. When I say what do you love is what would you do for free? And then the last thing is, very practically, what can I get paid for? And in the small circle of those 4 is what you should be doing. And generally the way that I tell people to answer those questions is number 1, deep reflection. Go off by yourself, turn off your phone, sit with a whiteboard or a piece of paper and just think. The other is wide exposure. Go have as many conversations with as many different people as possible. And if you do those 2 things for long enough, you'll figure it out.
And now looking forward, when you think about what you're doing now, the next decade of work, what are you most hopeful about? There's a lot going on right now.
We are in a time of deep uncertainty and deep fear. I think in the best scenarios, those types of times lead to a tremendous change in innovation. And I went to a conference, this was earlier this year. I think it was earlier this year. Sherilyn Ifill from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, she gave a virtual talk, and she talked about, and these are for anyone who's a church person, but even with something that we've probably all heard, there's a time to reap and a time to sow. And I think this is a sowing time. And so what I am most hopeful for is what as a society and as a world, there'll be a bunch of changes that we probably needed to make for a long period of time, particularly in terms of how we treat one another, that we will make because of the crazy, fearful, uncertain time that we're in. That's 1. I think 2, I think there is a recognition that people are the limiting factor to the success and the progress that we want. That be economically, that be socially, that be from an innovation perspective. And at least in my time in government and even afterward, that recognition is pretty widely held now across sector, across political ideology, across geography. That is hopeful. I think lastly, it's like a 3A and a 3B. There's promise and peril in all these emerging technologies, from AI to quantum, but also a bunch of others. Used well, so they can help us get to a bunch of things that we didn't think were possible. Used poorly, they compound a bunch of things that already make the world a tough place, that already make human beings tough to deal with. And so that's the promise and the peril. But actually, almost a year ago exactly, I got to go to the King Center and do a panel on AI with Reverend King. And she asked a question, which is, what would my dad want said about AI if it was successful? And it was a profound question. And I basically said, God, I didn't know the man, but I said, look, I would think that Dr. King would hope that if we use AI correctly, we would someday talk about, there used to be this thing called poverty, and someone figured out AI. We figured it out. There used to be these diseases that killed kids that we figured out because of this. There used to be people who literally couldn't figure out where their meal was going to come from, how they're going to pay for a house, and we were able to use these tools to figure it out. That is the measure of whether AI did what it was supposed to. It's not market cap. It's not revenue. It's not net income, although those things are important. It's actually, did we change and improve the human condition because of these tools? And I think there is the opportunity for that. There is also the opportunity that, candidly, at our worst, we simply use it to enrich the few and not necessarily improve the lives of the many. So those are what I'm hopeful. 1, that after fear and uncertainty comes change. 2, that this recognition that people are the limiting factor that we need to invest in, it becomes even more widely spread than it is right now. And I think that's actually already happening. Then thirdly, that we use these emerging technologies to feed the best parts of us and not the worst.
So now I'd love, last question, actually flip the mic. And what's one question you have for me that I can hopefully answer?
Yeah, you've done a lot of these conversations.
Yeah.
And I'll say I have a lot of these types of conversations now with people who are, again, in this time of uncertainty and change, are looking for the next thing. Think about all the conversations you've had like this when people have talked about these transitions. What's some advice you would give to somebody based on all the conversations that you've heard that, hey, let's say you are in a new job or looking for a new job, either by your own choice or not. Based on all the conversations that you've had, what advice would you give that person at this moment?
Great question. At this moment, what I would say is that people need to give themselves time and space to think appropriately. Why I say that is because one of the premise of the show is from the Great Resignation, and why I started it was around I didn't understand why people would leave stability during a time of instability. And as these conversations started unfolding, what I recognized was that when the pandemic happened, actually, let me back up. What I recognized is that we're always asking ourselves these questions around work and things we'd want to do and why we're doing this and all that. And sadly, we never give ourselves an opportunity to actually sit down and answer those questions until something forces us to. And what the pandemic did was forced everybody to slow down. You didn't have to travel an hour each way or 45 minutes each way to go to work. You were at home, right? Some people, unfortunately, they got furloughed, right? So there was nothing to do. They had to sit with their thoughts for an uncomfortable amount of time. But what I started hearing and what I started seeing and then fleshing out in these conversations is that time was actually a benefit for them. Because now those questions, because they never go away, right? Those questions never go away. They started popping up again. And you know what people did? They started being real with themselves and they started
Mm,
answering those questions.
mm,
And what they discovered was that, you know what, this maybe isn't for me. And not everybody's trying to own their own business and do
mm.
all that, but the org that I'm working at now is not aligned with who I am and who I'm becoming at this stage of my life. I need to find a better place that is more in alignment. One. Or two, you know what? I've always wanted to do this thing to help others in some type of way. Wow, I got a lot of time to do that. I had one guy who was telling me, he's like, look, he was like, an hour on one end of commute, an hour on the back end of commute. Guess what, Brian? That's 2 hours that I could then work on this thing. And you know what? I don't need a lunch at home. There's another 30 minutes. So there's 2.5 hours a day that I could be working on this thing that I said I always wanted to do. And we start compounding things, 2 and 5, that's 10 hours a week. That's damn near
Mhm.
part-time job, right? And so that's what I would say to folks. I would say if you're in this moment and you don't know what to do and everything is hectic right now, you need to find a way to pause, reflect, go somewhere quiet or whatever works for you, but pause, reflect, and then choose which direction you're going to go. Because I think it does go back to what you're saying. You need to know where you're going to go, but I think you need to give yourself time and space to think about that intentionally.
I so agree with that. And in some ways, you can't be glib about the where you're going. You actually have to be intentional. That's why I say again, it's a combination. I think deep reflection, and I also think deep exposure. Talk to as many people as you can. At times, you will hear a thing, and you're like, oh wait, that's it. It's so important because so many people, and the way I say it is, I want people to end up in the type of job that they want to be in, job, role, career they want to be in, partially because I want that for people. I think secondly, in a crazy time in the life of the country and the world, until people get in the jobs and the careers they want to be in, they are not mentally free to think the bigger thoughts we need them to think. And, I always say this because, I serve in the government, but there are people who I want their brains on the bigger questions because we need that now and we're gonna need it on the other side of kind of all of what's happening now. And so that's super, super helpful. And look, I end where I began, which is thank you for creating the space for this conversation that people are gonna need to have, particularly now. I'm from the DMV. We got a lot of people who are forcibly answering this question for themselves right now. And I think you've created, I think, an amazing space and roadmap for people to follow.
Appreciate that. And I want to thank you for coming on the show today. As I mentioned earlier, of course, I appreciate the nudge for PLS back in the day, definitely life changing. And I'd love to continue following your work and would love for you to share where people can find you online and support some of this work that you're doing going forward.
No, thank you so much. To follow me, really easy to find. Feel free to follow the Kapor Center at kaporcenter.org, KAPORCENTER.org. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only one of me on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find. You can find me on Twitter at CRAGUH or Instagram, Chike Aguh, one word. But those are easy ways to find me.
Love that. Thank you for all that info. And look, that'll do it for today's episode. Again, I want to thank Chike Aguh for joining me today. All of his information will be in the show notes. Hope you all have a great week, and we'll definitely see you next time. Chike, have a good one.
You too.
Thanks for listening to Why I Left. Join us next time for more inspiring stories about growth, resilience, and transformation. Visit us online at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co.